The stagecoach lurched sideways the moment the first rifle shot cracked across Rawhide Creek, and Jasper Watkins felt the whole world tilt as if God himself had grabbed the coach and given it a shake. He had been watching the water since Fort Laramie, the way the spring melt had turned the crossing into a brown, churning rope of current, and he had already told the driver twice that the ford looked too high for a loaded coach. Nobody had listened to a cattle buyer with ink-stained cuffs. Now the front wheel caught a submerged rock, the traces snapped, and the whole rig went over with a groan of wood and a scream of terrified horses, throwing Jasper hard against the door frame before the world went black water and mud. He came up Spitting Creek water, one boot gone, his ledger case still somehow clutched against his ribs out of pure animal instinct. Through the ringing in his ears he heard shouting, and gunfire again. 3 shots this time, flat and businesslike, coming from the cottonwoods on the near bank. The coach lay on its side in 4 feet of racing water, one wheel still spinning uselessly in the air, and inside it, muffled and desperate, somebody was pounding on the door and screaming for help. "Get the horses cut loose," Jasper shouted to the driver, old Amos Feeney, who was dragging himself up the bank with blood running from his scalp. Amos only waved a weak hand and went down again. There was nobody else. The 2 other passengers who had boarded at Fort Laramie, a drummer selling patent medicine and a young corporal headed for reassignment, were both scrambling for the bank themselves, too shocked or too frightened to think about anyone still trapped. That left Jasper and whoever else was in that overturned coach fighting the rising water. He waded back into the current, fighting the pull of it against his legs, and threw himself against the coach door, which now faced straight up toward the gray morning sky. It would not budge. Water was pouring in through the shattered window below. "Hold on," he bellowed down through the gap. "I am coming." "Then come faster," a woman's voice answered, sharp and steady despite the fear in it, "because there is a man in here with his leg pinned and the water is up past his chest." Jasper had expected panic. He had not expected orders. He set his shoulder against the door, braced his boots on the coach's undercarriage, and heaved, and the door groaned open 2 inches before slamming back down on his fingers. He swore, shook the pain off, and tried again, and this time a second set of hands appeared from below, small and strong, pushing up from the inside even as water sloshed around a woman's shoulders. He got his first real look at her then, hair come loose from its pins and plastered dark against her face, a gray traveling dress soaked through, and eyes the color of good gun bluing, calm in a way that made his own racing heart slow half a step just from being near it. "On 3, she said, as if they had known each other for years and not seconds. 1, 2, they heaved together, and the door swung up and over and crashed down against the coach's flank, and Jasper reached in and hauled the woman out first, though she twisted immediately to reach back down for the trapped passenger, a heavy-set rancher named Prout who had boarded at the last relay station. "His boot is wedged under the seat frame," she said. "I cannot free it alone." More gunfire sounded from the trees, closer now, and Jasper understood in that instant that whoever had shot out the traces meant to finish whatever business they had started. He did not have time to be afraid of it. He slid down into the flooded coach beside her, found the rancher's boot jammed against the twisted iron seat brace, and threw his weight against the metal until it groaned and gave. The woman pulled the rancher up and out by main strength while Jasper pushed from below, and together they dragged him, coughing and half-drowned, up onto the coach's exposed underside, and then down into the shallower water near the bank. Only when they had the rancher laid out safe on the mud, retching up creek water, did Jasper turn back to see the woman already crouched low, watching the tree line with an expression that had gone from rescuer to soldier in the space of a breath. She had a small leather satchel clutched against her chest that she had apparently not let go of through the entire ordeal, and beneath the torn hem of her sleeve he caught the glint of a badge pinned to a vest she wore under her traveling coat. "You are a lawwoman," he said, because it seemed important to say it out loud, to make it true by naming it. "Deputy United States Marshal Mae Beckett," she said, not looking at him, still watching the trees. "And unless I am very much mistaken, those men did not shoot our traces by accident. Get down." He got down. A moment later, a bullet clipped the coach's exposed wheel with a spray of splinters, and Mae Beckett had a revolver out from somewhere in her ruined skirts and was firing back with a steadiness that told him this was not the first time she had done such a thing. Jasper Watkins had bought and sold cattle across 3 territories for 11 years, had faced down angry ranchers over short-weighted steers and drunk cowhands over docked wages, but he had never in his life been shot at from ambush on a flooded creek crossing, and some distant, foolish part of his mind noted that he was, at this precise moment, more frightened of losing his footing in the current than of the rifle fire. "There," Mae said, pointing with her chin toward a flash of movement in the willows upstream. "2 of them, maybe 3. They are not coming down to finish us. They are watching to see if the satchel survived the wreck. What is in it?" "Evidence," she said, and something in her voice closed the subject as firmly as a door. "Get the others behind the coach. It will hold against the current a while yet, and it will stop a bullet better than open ground." He did not argue. There was something in the set of her jaw, in the economical way she moved, even soaked to the skin and shaking with cold, that made arguing feel like a waste of both their time. He helped the drummer and the young corporal drag Amos Feeney and the half-drowned rancher behind the overturned coach, and there they crouched, 5 frightened travelers and 1 very calm deputy marshal, while the gunfire from the trees tapered off into an uneasy silence. They waited a long 15 minutes before Mae judged it safe to move, and in that time Jasper found himself watching her more than watching the tree line, noting how she reloaded her revolver with hands that did not shake despite the cold, how she kept glancing at the satchel as though it weighed more than all their lives combined, how, once, when the corporal began to weep quietly from the shock of it, she reached over without a word and gripped his shoulder, hard and brief, the way an older sister might. Before returning her eyes to the willows, "They are gone," she said finally, "for now." "For now," Jasper repeated. "You expect them to come back." "I expect," Mae Beckett said, wringing water from her sleeve with a grim economy of motion, "that whoever hired those men to shoot out our traces did not do it for sport, Mr. Watkins, Jasper Watkins. I buy cattle for the Cheyenne Commission House of Aldrich and Sons." Something flickered across her face at that, quick and assessing. "A cattle buyer. An honest one," he said, "which around these parts I have come to learn is apparently a hanging offense to some men." She almost smiled at that, the first softening he had seen in her since the coach went over. "Then perhaps, Mr. Watkins, you and I have more in common than a flooded creek." They got the rancher and the drummer and the corporal walking, and between the 5 of them and Amos Feeney, who insisted on walking despite the gash in his scalp, they made their slow way up out of the creek bottom toward Rawhide Butte Station, 3 miles distant by the military road, the only shelter for 20 miles in any direction. The morning had gone gray and cold, the kind of raw spring chill that came down off the Laramie Mountains even as the meadows below burst green with new grass, and Jasper walked beside Mae Beckett with his ruined boot squelching and his ledger case, saved by nothing but luck, clutched against his chest, and he found himself thinking that whatever had put a United States deputy marshal on this coach, and whoever had wanted her dead badly enough to wreck it, was very likely the same trouble that had been dogging his own ledgers for the better part of a year. He was right, though it would take 3 days and a great deal of trust neither of them expected to give so quickly for either of them to fully understand how right he was. Rawhide Butte Station sat low against a shoulder of red rock, a squat log building with a sod roof, and a corral out back where a station keeper named Orrin Hollies kept relay stock for the stage line. Orrin's wife, a broad, capable woman named Sarah Hollies, took one look at the bedraggled party coming up the road and had blankets and coffee going before they had even reached the door. It was Sarah who cut Jasper out of his ruined boot and wrapped his bruised fingers, and it was Sarah who, once the others were settled and dozing by the fire, drew Mae Beckett aside and asked, low and careful, whether the trouble on the road had anything to do with the Dunmore combine. Jasper was not meant to hear that exchange, tucked as he was in the corner nursing a cup of chicory coffee, but the cabin was small and voices carried, and the name Dunmore struck him like a spark to dry tinder. "You know that name," Mae said afterward, coming to sit across the rough table from him once Sarah had gone to see to supper. She had changed into a spare dress of Sarah's, too large in the shoulders. Her own gray traveling dress hung steaming near the fire. Her hair, dried and repinned, had a wave to it that the creek water had not managed to destroy, and Jasper made himself look at his coffee instead of at her. "I know it better than I would like," he said. "Cyrus Dunmore holds paper on half the range between here and the Belle Forge, and he has spent 2 years buying up brands, buying up water rights, and buying up any small rancher too proud or too poor to sell outright. The ones who will not sell tend to have accidents, fires, lost cattle. A man drowned in an irrigation ditch last summer that anyone with sense could see had been held under. His name is on documents I am carrying to the circuit court at Larkspur Crossing," Mae said quietly. "Forged brand inspections, deeds signed by men who could not write their own names, witnessed by men who were 3 counties away on the dates in question. Affidavits from 4 homestead families describing threats made against them by Dunmore's foreman, a man named Reeve Coltrane, and 1 affidavit describing a killing that was made to look like an accident." Jasper set his cup down very carefully. "Who's killing?" Mae looked at him for a long moment before she answered, and when she spoke her voice had gone flat and careful in the way of someone reciting a fact she had made herself say many times so that it would eventually stop hurting. "My husband's, Deputy United States Marshal Thomas Beckett. He was investigating the Dunmore Combine's land claims 8 months ago when his horse came back to Larkspur Crossing without him. They found him 3 days later at the bottom of Antelope Gulch and called it a fall." "You do not believe it was a fall?" "I know it was not a fall," Mae said. "Tom rode that gulch 100 times. He knew every switchback in it better than his own name. And there was a rope burn on his saddle horn that had no business being there unless something, or someone, had dragged that horse hard enough to leave a mark." She turned her coffee cup slowly on the rough table. "Marshal Whitfield in Cheyenne could not spare another deputy to finish the investigation. I had ridden with Tom for 6 years before we married, and after, and I knew the case near as well as he did. So Marshal Whitfield swore me in himself, temporary commission, to carry the evidence Tom had already gathered to the circuit judge before it could disappear the way 3 other sets of papers have disappeared from that county in the last 2 years. Jasper sat with that a long moment, the fire popping, Sarah Hollies's pot clattering in the next room, and felt something settle into place in his chest, cold and certain as creek water. "My ledgers," he said, "show that Dunmore's combine has been shorting every independent rancher who sells through the Cheyenne yards by an average of 11 pounds a head, blaming it on trail weight loss, while his own cattle, run through the same scales, come in heavier than any animal has a right to be after 100 miles of driving. I have been keeping a second set of true weights for the better part of a year, matched against his falsified brand counts, because I could not make the numbers lie down and behave no matter how I tried. Aldrich sent me out this spring to deliver those ledgers personally to the Stock Growers Committee in Cheyenne rather than trust them to the mail, because 2 other sets of records critical of Dunmore's counts have gone missing from freight offices this year alone." Mae's eyes had sharpened on him. "Then whoever shot out our traces this morning may have wanted my satchel," she said slowly. "Or they may have wanted your ledger case, or God help us both, they may have wanted whichever one of us survived the wreck to carry the tale no further." "Then it appears," Jasper said, and found, despite the circumstances, that the corner of his mouth wanted to lift, "that you and I are riding the same road for the same reason, Mrs. Beckett, whether either of us planned it that way." Deputy Marshal Beckett, she corrected, but there was no heat in it, only a kind of tired honesty. Though I suppose out here a title does not count for much if the man attached to it means to kill you regardless. It counts for a great deal to me, Jasper said. I have never yet met a woman who could pull a man out of a flooded coach and reload a revolver in the same 10 minutes. Whatever else is true, ma'am, I would rather have you beside me on this road than most any deputy I have known, marshal or otherwise. She looked at him then in a way that made him feel unexpectedly young, as if she were weighing him the way she might weigh a piece of testimony, and whatever she found seemed to satisfy her, because the corner of her own mouth eased just slightly into something that was not quite a smile but was kin to one. "We will see how you hold up, Mr. Watkins," she said, "before I decide whether that is a compliment or a worry." They stayed at Rawhide Buttes 2 days while Amos Feeney's head wound healed enough for travel, and a relief coach was sent for from Fort Laramie. And in that time, Jasper Watkins learned a great deal about Mae Beckett that had nothing to do with ledgers or evidence and everything to do with the woman herself. He learned she had grown up on a horse ranch outside Fort Collins, one of 5 daughters, and had been shooting prairie dogs for her father's bounty money since she was 9 years old. He learned she had married Tom Beckett at 19, following him from posting to posting for 6 years before a federal appointment brought them to Larkspur Crossing, and that she had buried him without shedding a tear in front of anyone, though Sarah Hollies, who had known the Becketts for years, told Jasper quietly one evening that Mae had wept for 3 days straight the first week alone in that empty house before she ever picked up her husband's badge, and asked Marshal Whitfield to let her finish his work. "She is not a woman who wants rescuing," Sarah told him, stirring beans over the fire while Mae walked the corral fence outside, checking the relief horses with the same careful attention she gave everything. "But she has been carrying that grief and that evidence both alone for 8 months now, Mr. Watkins, and I think it has worn a groove in her that a body was never meant to walk alone." Jasper thought about that for a long while, watching Mae through the small window, the lantern light catching gold in her hair, her rifle propped within easy reach against the corral post even while she worked. He was 34 years old and had never married, had told himself for years that his ledgers and his long seasons on the trail left no room in his life for a wife, and he was honest enough with himself to admit, standing in Sarah Hollies' kitchen with the smell of beans and wood smoke thick around him, that he had never in his life wanted so badly to walk beside someone as he wanted to walk beside Mae Beckett, not to rescue her, but simply to be there when the next flood came. Whatever shape it took. The relief coach arrived on the 3rd morning, but Mae made a decision that surprised the driver and pleased Jasper more than he let himself show. Larkspur Crossing, the county seat where the circuit court sat, and where the evidence needed to go, lay another 2 days north along the military road. But so did the Beckett homestead, the 80 acres Tom Beckett had proved up before his death, sitting square in the middle of the creek bottom that Cyrus Dunmore's combine needed to control if his cattle were ever going to have year-round water without paying grazing fees to a dozen small ranchers. "I want to stop at my place first," Mae told Jasper as they loaded into the new coach, this one drawn by a fresh 6-horse hitch and driven by a wary young man named Cal who kept one hand near his own revolver the whole way out of the station yard. "There is a strongbox buried under the floor of my spring house that holds copies of everything in this satchel, in case the originals do not survive the road. I would feel a great deal easier delivering evidence to Judge Pruitt if I know there is a second set safe where Dunmore's men cannot reach it." "Judge Pruitt," Jasper said carefully. "I have heard that name spoken with less than full confidence in Cheyenne." "You have heard correctly," Mae said. "Elias Pruitt has sat the circuit bench in Larkspur Crossing for 6 years, and in that time he has ruled in Dunmore's favor in 11 land disputes and against him in exactly none. I do not trust him with the only copies of evidence that could see him removed from that bench, along with the man who put him there. Which is why," she added, and here she looked at Jasper with an expression that mixed calculation with something warmer. "I intend to deliver copies to the federal court in Cheyenne as well, over Prute's head, the moment the roads allow it. But first, my homestead." The military road north from Rawhide Buttes ran through country coming alive with the particular violence of a Wyoming spring. Meadows gone electric green after the snowmelt. Creeks running high and fast and brown with mountain silt. Meadowlarks singing from every fence post as though they had personally been commissioned to announce the season. And everywhere the small, staggering shapes of new calves finding their legs in the mud. Jasper had ridden this road a dozen times buying cattle, and had never once seen it look so much like a place worth fighting for. And he understood, watching Mae's face as the coach crested the rise above her homestead, and the little cabin came into view with its new-turned garden plot, and its sagging but sturdy barn, that this was exactly what Cyrus Dunmore intended to take from her, not out of any pressing need, but because a woman alone on 80 acres with a dead husband's badge was precisely the kind of obstacle a powerful man found it easiest to simply remove. They found the homestead undisturbed, the springhouse strongbox exactly where Mae had left it, and that night, with copies of the evidence safely divided between the strongbox and Mae's satchel, Jasper sat on the porch step beside her while the last light drained out of the western sky and the first frogs began singing down in the creek bottom, and he told her, plainly and without artifice, that he did not intend to simply see her safely to Larkspur Crossing and then ride on to Cheyenne as though none of this had touched him. "My ledgers and your evidence tell the same story from two different directions," he said. "Dunmore's combine cannot survive both sets of books being read by the same honest judge. That makes us allies whether either of us intended it, but I will tell you plainly, Mae Beckett, that is not the only reason I mean to stay close to this road until the matter is settled." She did not look at him right away, her eyes on the darkening tree line where the creek ran loud with snowmelt. "Say the rest of it then, Mr. Watkins. I have found you a man who generally says what he means." "I have not felt this glad to be alive in a good many years," he said, "and I did not feel it until a woman I had known less than an hour hauled me down into a flooded coach to save a stranger's life without a single thought for her own. I do not know what you want from a man, or whether you want one at all, given what the last one cost you, but I would consider it an honor to find out." Mae was quiet long enough that a whip-poor-will called twice from the willows before she answered. "I have not let myself think past Larkspur Crossing in 8 months, she said finally. "I did not think there would be anything left of me to think with, once Dunmore was answered for. But I will say this much, Jasper Watkins. I have ridden a great many miles with a great many men since Tom died, deputies and drivers and soldiers escorting the mail, and not one of them made me feel the way I felt watching you throw yourself back into that creek for a stranger's sake. That is not nothing. I do not intend to pretend it is nothing. It was not a promise, not yet, but it was enough to carry them both through the 2 hard days that followed, days spent riding the military road north with Mae's rifle across her saddle bow, and Jasper's ledger case lashed tight behind his own, both of them watching the tree lines the way people watch tree lines when they have already learned, in the worst possible way, that the land itself can hide men who mean to kill you. They reached the way station at Old Woman's Fork on the evening of the second day, a larger relay stop than Rawhide Buttes, with a proper barn and a bunkhouse where drovers sometimes overnighted, run by a homesteading family named Holly's cousins, the Garretts, who had 4 children and a herd of new spring calves and a look about them. Jasper thought the moment he saw them, of people who had already been leaned on hard by somebody with more money than conscience. He was right about that too. Over supper, served at a long table crowded with children and hired hands, Amos Garrett told them in a low voice, once the youngest children had been sent off to bed, that Dunmore's foreman Reeve Coltrane had ridden through 3 weeks prior with 4 armed men, and informed him that the Garrett homestead sat on land the combine had bought fair and square from the territory, regardless of what the Garrett family's own patent papers said. and that it would go easier on everyone if the Garretts simply signed a bill of sale and moved along before spring roundup. "We did not sign," Amos Garrett said, jaw tight. "But we have lost 11 calves to what Coltrane calls wolves and what I call men with rifles since that visit. And 2 weeks back somebody put a torch to my hay barn in the middle of the night. We got the fire out before it took the main barn, but it was close enough that I have not slept easy since." Mee's hand had gone very still on the table. "Would you swear to that in front of a circuit judge, Mr. Garrett? All of it, the threats, the calves, the fire." "I would swear to it in front of God Almighty," Garrett said. "But I will tell you plain, ma'am. Judge Pruitt has heard testimony like mine before from 3 other families along this road, and every time it has come to nothing, because the men who did the burning always seem to have alibis signed by other men who work for Dunmore, and the judge never seems inclined to look too hard at the ink. This time will be different," Mee said, and there was a quiet steel in her voice that made even the hired hands at the far end of the table look up. "I am carrying testimony to the federal court in Cheyenne, as well as the circuit court at Larkspur Crossing, over Judge Pruitt's head if I must. Marshal Whitfield already has affidavits from 3 families describing exactly what you have just told me. Yours will make 4. And Mr. Watkins here carries ledgers that show the combine has been defrauding every honest rancher who sells through the Cheyenne yards for the better part of 2 years. Between the 2 of us, Mr. Garrett, we intend to see that ink looked at very hard indeed." It was that promise, spoken plainly at a crowded supper table with children's voices drifting down from the loft above, that seemed to settle something in Jasper's chest. A certainty that whatever came next, he was no longer merely a cattle buyer caught up in trouble that belonged to someone else. He had chosen a side, and more than that, he had chosen the woman standing beside him on it, and he found he did not regret either choice one particle. The trouble came that same night, faster and harder than any of them had reason to expect. Jasper woke to the sound of a dog barking wild and frantic somewhere near the barn, and beneath it, unmistakable even through sleep, the low drumming of many horses approaching at speed. He was up and pulling on his boots before he had fully finished waking, and by the time he reached the front room of the Garrett house, Mee was already there, rifle in hand, standing at the window with the calm, terrible focus he was coming to recognize as her particular way of meeting danger. "6 riders," she said quietly. "Maybe 7, coming in from the North Road." She glanced at Amos Garrett, who had appeared behind them buttoning his shirt, shotgun already in hand. "Get your family into the root cellar. Now, Mr. Garrett, please." There was no time to argue and no inclination to. Garrett hustled his wife and children down through the trapdoor in the kitchen floor, while Jasper checked the loads in the revolver Sarah Hollies had loaned him back at Rawhide Buttes, a heavy old Remington that felt foreign and reassuring in his hand all at once. "They will go for the barn first," Mee said. "New calves, hired hands sleeping in the bunkhouse, easiest place to do damage fast and be gone before anyone can organize a defense. That is how Coltrane has hit 3 other homesteads this spring, always at night, always fast." She was right. Through the window they watched torches bloom to life among the approaching riders, and Jasper felt something cold and furious rise in his chest at the casual cruelty of it. Men willing to burn a family's new calves and a season's hay simply to make a point about who owned what. "We cannot let them reach that barn," he said. "No," Mee agreed, already moving for the door. "We cannot." What followed was not the clean, deliberate gunfight of dime novels, but a chaotic, terrifying scramble in the dark. Jasper and Mee, and the 2 Garrett hired hands spreading out along the corral fence to put themselves between the riders and the barn, shouting warnings that were answered with gunfire rather than argument. Mee's rifle spoke twice, aimed low and deliberate at the legs of the lead rider's horse rather than at the man himself, and the horse stumbled and threw its rider hard into the mud, breaking the charge's momentum. Jasper fired the Remington into the air over the riders' heads, once, twice. shouting that they were covered from 3 sides and that anyone who touched that barn would answer for it in front of a federal marshal. And whether it was the shouted warning or the sight of Mae's badge catching torchlight as she stepped forward into the open, rifle leveled and steady, the riders wheeled and scattered rather than pressing the attack, one of them shouting back over his shoulder that this was not finished, that Coltrane would be back, that Mrs. Beckett had best remember what happened to lawmen who went digging where they were not wanted. The threat hung in the smoke and torchlight long after the hoofbeats faded, and Jasper found me standing very still at the corral fence, rifle still raised, her whole body trembling now that the danger had passed, not from fear, he realized, but from the same furious grief that had been driving her for 8 months, finally finding a target close enough to strike. "That was Coltrane's voice," she said quietly. "I would know it anywhere. He was there the night Tom died. I am certain of it, though I have never been able to prove it." "Then we will prove it," Jasper said, reaching out to steady her, his hand closing over hers on the rifle stock, and she let herself lean just slightly into the solid warmth of him, there in the smoke and torch stink and the frightened lowing of calves in the barn behind them. "We will prove all of it, Mae, every last piece." They did not sleep again that night, sitting up instead with the Garretts in their hired hands, rifles across their laps, until the sky began to gray toward dawn, and it was in those quiet hours, exhausted and wrung out and still half sick with the aftermath of violence, that Mae finally told him the rest of what she had been carrying alone since Tom Beckett's death, how she had found her husband's body herself, having ridden out when he did not return, how she had known within the hour that no fall had killed him, how she had spent every night since imagining Reeve Coltrane's face and wondering if she would ever have the chance to say his name in front of a judge who would actually listen. "I am so sorry," Jasper said, and meant it with his whole chest. "I do not want your pity, Jasper Watkins," Mae said, though there was no sharpness in it, only weariness. "I want justice. I have wanted it so long I have nearly forgotten what wanting anything else feels like." "Then let me help you find it," he said, "not because I pity you. Because I have come to admire you more than any person I have met in a long while, and because what Dunmore is doing to this valley is a plain wrong that needs answering, and because," and here his voice roughened, unplanned, honest, "because somewhere on that flooded creek 3 days ago, I stopped being able to imagine riding on to Cheyenne without you." Mae looked at him for a long moment in the gray pre-dawn light, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and old grief, and something in her face opened just slightly, like a door long kept locked finally allowing a crack of light through. "I am not ready to promise you anything, Jasper," she said. "There is too much unfinished. But I will say that I have not minded, these last 3 days, having you beside me on this road. That is more than I have said to any man since I buried my husband. It would have to be enough, for now, and Jasper found that it was. They reached Larkspur Crossing 2 days later, road-worn and weary, to find the small county seat humming with an uneasy tension that told them Coltrane's raid on the Garrett place had not been an isolated event. Word had already reached town of 2 other homesteads burned that same week further south along the road, and Judge Elias Prout, when Mae presented herself at his chambers with her satchel of evidence, received her with a courtesy so smooth and careful that Jasper, standing silent at her shoulder, felt his instincts prickle with distrust before the judge had finished his first sentence of welcome. "Deputy Marshal Beckett," Prout said, rising from behind a broad desk in an office that smelled of good cigars and better whiskey, a portly man with silver whiskers and small, watchful eyes. "Your late husband's dedication to this county was well known. I trust you have had a safe journey." "Safe enough, Your Honor," Mae said, her voice giving away nothing. "Though our coach was ambushed at Rawhide Creek, and the Garrett homestead at Old Woman's Fork was raided by 6 armed riders 3 nights past. I would like to file affidavits regarding both incidents, along with the evidence my husband gathered before his death regarding fraudulent land transfers connected to the Dunmore Combine." Something flickered behind Prout's eyes, there, and gone so quickly that Jasper might have imagined it had he not spent 11 years reading the faces of men trying to cheat him on cattle weights. Of course, the judge said. Leave the documents with my clerk, and I will review them personally at the earliest opportunity. These matters require careful handling, Mrs. Beckett. I trust you understand the importance of proper procedure. I understand the importance of justice, Your Honor, Mae said evenly, and I will be sending duplicate copies of every document to Marshal Whitfield's office in Cheyenne by tomorrow's mail, so that proper procedure may proceed on two fronts at once. I trust that will not cause any difficulty. Pruitt's smile did not waver, but something in the room's temperature seemed to drop several degrees. No difficulty at all, he said, though I would remind you, Mrs. Beckett, that this is a federal territory, and federal patience with private citizens playing at investigation, however well-intentioned, does have its limits. I am not a private citizen playing at anything, Your Honor, Mae said, and drew herself up in a way that made her seem, for a moment, taller than she was. I hold a valid commission from Marshal Whitfield, properly sworn and filed. I would ask that you treat this evidence with the seriousness that commission demands. They left the judge's chambers with the distinct impression, shared without either needing to say it aloud until they were well clear of the courthouse steps, that Elias Pruitt had already made up his mind about which side of this fight he stood on, and that the copies bound for Cheyenne might well be the only ones that ever saw honest daylight. He will bury it, Jasper said flatly, once they were seated in the small hotel dining room, the only decent meal Larkspur Crossing had to offer. Or lose it, or find some procedural reason to dismiss it before it ever reaches a jury. I expect you are right, Mae said, which is why I am not leaving the originals in his hands 1 hour longer than the law requires. I will send the copies to Cheyenne tomorrow, as I said, and I intend to ride to Cheyenne myself within the week to present the case to Marshal Whitfield in person, rather than trust it to the mail a second time. But first, and here her jaw set in a way Jasper had learned meant her mind was thoroughly made up. First, I intend to go home and finish planting my garden, because Cyrus Dunmore has taken enough of my life already, and I will be damned if I let him take my potatoes too. Jasper laughed despite himself, a real laugh that surprised him with how good it felt after the tension of the judge's chambers, and Mae's own mouth curved, reluctant but genuine. And for a moment, sitting across a rough hotel table with road dust still on both their collars, it was possible to believe that ordinary life, gardens and suppers and easy laughter, might still be waiting for them on the other side of all this trouble. It was not to prove so simple, of course. Word of Mae's visit to Judge Pruitt's chambers reached the Dunmore Ranch, some 15 miles distant, faster than either of them expected, and it was 3 days later, back at the Beckett homestead with Jasper having stayed on, ostensibly to help repair a section of fence damaged by winter frost heave, but in truth because neither of them had raised the subject of him leaving, and both seemed equally content to let that silence stand. That Cyrus Dunmore himself came riding up the lane with Reeve Coltrane and 4 armed men at his back. Jasper saw them coming from the barn, where he had been mending a hinge, and felt his stomach drop even as something else, something harder and more resolved, rose up beneath the fear. He set down his tools and walked out to stand in the yard between the approaching riders and the cabin door, where Mae had been inside working at the kitchen table. Cyrus Dunmore was not what Jasper had expected. He had pictured somehow a crude and brutal man, and instead found himself facing a lean, silver-templed rancher of perhaps 55, dressed in a fine dark coat despite the mud, sitting his horse with the easy authority of a man who had never once in his adult life doubted that the world would arrange itself to his convenience. "You would be the cattle buyer," Dunmore said, reining up perhaps 20 feet from where Jasper stood, his men fanning out slightly behind him, Coltrane's hard, flat face unreadable beneath his hat brim. "Watkins, is it? Aldrich's man." "That is my name," Jasper said, keeping his voice level though his heart hammered. "I do not believe I know yours, though I have heard a great deal about you these last 2 weeks. Then you know I do not care for men who keep 2 sets of books to make honest ranchers look like thieves," Dunmore said. "And you know, I would imagine, what tends to happen to such men when they persist in spreading their falsehoods. I know that the only falsehoods I have found on this road belong to your combine's brand inspectors," Jasper said. "And I know that a woman's husband is dead because he tried to bring those falsehoods to light. And I know that 6 armed men rode down on an innocent family's barn 3 nights ago on your foreman's orders. I do not much care for men who burn barns and threaten widows, Mr. Dunmore, and I do not intend to be moved off this land by the likes of you." Dunmore's mouth thinned. "This is not your land to defend, Watkins. This is a business matter between myself and Mrs. Beckett, and I would advise you to remove yourself from it before it becomes something considerably less civil." "It stopped being merely a business matter," a new voice said, cool and clear, "the night your foreman ordered my husband's horse driven off a switchback trail in Antelope Gulch. Mae had come out onto the porch, and she was not empty-handed. She carried her husband's Winchester rifle, the same one she had used to break the charge at the Garrett homestead, and she came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to stand directly beside Jasper, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her even through the cold spring air, and raised the rifle to a low, ready position that made Coltrane's men shift uneasily in their saddles. "Mrs. Beckett," Dunmore said, and for the first time something like genuine wariness entered his voice. "I have no quarrel with a grieving widow. I have only ever sought to purchase land at a fair price." "You sought to purchase my husband's silence," Mae said, "and when he would not sell that, you had him killed and called it an accident. I have 4 affidavits from homestead families describing threats and arson at your foreman's hand, a ledger from Mr. Watkins here documenting 2 years of fraudulent brand counts, and a set of forged deeds bearing signatures that could not possibly have been made by the men whose names appear on them. Copies of all of it are already on their way to Marshal Whitfield's office in Cheyenne, and more copies besides are buried in places you will never find, Mr. Dunmore. So before your man Coltrane decides whether he is fast enough to draw against a deputy United States Marshal in broad daylight, I would ask you both to consider very carefully what happens to a combine's fortunes when its owner hangs for murder." The silence that followed stretched taut enough that Jasper could hear his own pulse in his ears, could hear a meadowlark singing somewhere down by the creek, as though the world had not just balanced itself on the edge of a knife. Coltrane's hand had drifted toward his own revolver, and Jasper, without fully deciding to, stepped half a pace forward, placing himself slightly ahead of me even as she stood solid and unmoving beside him, rifle steady, and he understood in that moment that neither of them meant to be the one who flinched first, and that together, standing shoulder to shoulder in the mud of a homestead yard, they made a harder target than either would have made alone. "Reeve," Dunmore said finally quietly without taking his eyes off Mae's rifle, "stand down." Coltrane's hand stilled, though his eyes stayed hard on Mae's face, promising a reckoning that had only been delayed, not canceled. "You are making a grave error, Mrs. Beckett," Dunmore said, gathering his reins. "Judge Pruitt has presided over this county for 6 years and will continue to do so long after this evidence of yours has been lost in whatever filing cabinet it deserves. You would do well to remember that." "And you would do well to remember," Mae said, "that Judge Pruitt does not sit on the federal bench in Cheyenne, and that circuit judges can be removed by territorial authority when evidence of corruption reaches the right ears. I intend to see that it does." Dunmore said nothing further, only wheeled his horse and rode back down the lane with his men falling in behind him, Coltrane throwing one last look over his shoulder that Jasper felt land like a physical blow between his shoulder blades. And then they were gone, dust settling slowly in the spring air, and Jasper let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and turned to find me already lowering the rifle, her hands, for the first time since he had known her, trembling visibly. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "It was both," Mae said, "and I would not have managed either one standing here alone." She looked at him then, something raw and unguarded in her face that he had not seen before, not even in their most exhausted hours on the road. "You stepped in front of me, Jasper. You stepped up beside me," he said. "I do not believe either of us needed rescuing today, Mae. I believe we needed each other, and I do not intend to apologize for that." She did not answer in words, but she reached over and took his hand, there in the yard with the mud still churned by Dunmore's horses, and held it for a long moment before either of them thought to move, and something settled between them in that silence that felt more binding than any promise either had yet spoken aloud. They had perhaps a week of uneasy quiet after that, a week in which Mae's copied evidence reached Cheyenne and word came back that Marshal Whitfield himself intended to ride out personally to investigate, a week in which Jasper stayed on at the homestead, splitting his days between mending fence and riding with me to check on the Garrett family, and 2 other homesteads that had suffered Dunmore's attention, a week in which something quiet and certain grew up between them in the small moments, shared coffee at dawn, the easy companionship of working side by side, the particular tenderness of me showing him how to properly stake tomato plants in ground still cool from winter, of Jasper teaching her in turn the trick of reading a cattle brand for the small inconsistencies that marked a forgery. But the spring thaw that had brought them together was not finished with its business, and the second crisis, when it came, arrived not on horseback but in the form of water. It began with 3 days of hard, warm rain on top of a mountain snowpack that had already been melting fast, and by the 4th morning, Mae woke Jasper before dawn with her hand hard on his shoulder and fear plain in her voice for the first time since he had known her. "The creek," she said. "Come look." He came out onto the porch in his shirt sleeves to find the world transformed, the creek that ran along the edge of the homestead, normally a modest 20 feet across even at spring flood, now a roaring brown torrent nearly 80 feet wide, already lapping at the edge of the lower pasture where a dozen new calves and their mothers had been turned out to graze. "It has never come up this fast," Mae said. "Not in 6 years I have lived here. If it keeps rising it will take the barn by noon, and the Garrett place sits lower than we do. If it breaks over their creek bank the whole homestead will flood, house and all." There was no time for anything but action. Jasper saddled his horse before he had finished buttoning his shirt, and within the hour word had spread up and down the military road by the simple, ancient method of one rider telling the next, until nearly every family within 10 miles had converged on the low ground between the Beckett and Garrett homesteads, bringing shovels, wagons, and whatever timber could be spared, because a flood, unlike a land grabber's hired guns, made no distinction between friend and enemy. And every soul on that stretch of road understood that survival meant working together or not at all. It was me, standing calf-deep in cold mud with her skirts pinned up and her hair coming loose from its pins, who organized the effort with the same clear authority she brought to everything, directing the men to dig a diversion channel along the natural low swale that ran east of the Garrett barn, a channel that would, if dug deep and wide enough before the water arrived, carry the worst of the flood past the barn, and the house both and out into the open rangeland beyond where it could spread and lose its force without doing harm. "We need it 4 feet deep and 12 feet wide for at least 200 yards, she shouted over the roar of the rising water, "or it will not carry enough volume to matter. Jasper, take the men on the north end. I will take the south, and Amos, get every wagon you have hauling brush and rock to reinforce the banks where we tie back into the main channel." For the next 6 hours, Jasper worked harder than he had in his entire 11 years buying cattle, digging shoulder to shoulder with ranch hands and homesteaders, and even the Garrett children, who were set to hauling brush bundles too heavy for their small arms, but carried anyway with a fierce determination, that made more than one grown man work harder out of shame at being outdone by a 10-year-old. The rain had stopped by mid-morning, but the creek kept rising, fed by snowmelt from higher ground, and twice the diversion channel threatened to collapse before it was finished, requiring desperate scrambling to shore up the banks with fence rails and canvas and whatever else came to hand. It was mid-afternoon, with the channel perhaps three-quarters finished and the creek now lapping dangerously close to the Garrett barn's foundation, when Jasper, working near the channel's southern end, spotted a rider approaching fast from the direction of the Dunmore ranch, and felt his stomach clench with the certainty that trouble had chosen the worst possible moment to return. But it was not Coltrane, and it was not an attack. It was a young cowhand Jasper recognized vaguely from the Dunmore spread, riding bareback and hatless, his horse lathered with hard use, and he pulled up hard beside where Jasper and me stood surveying the channel's progress. "Mr. Dunmore sent me," the young man gasped out. "His lower pastures are flooding too, worse than yours, on account of the creek splits and takes the hard current straight through his calving grounds. He has 30 new calves down there that will drown by nightfall if somebody does not help him get a diversion dug on his side too, and he does not have enough hands, on account of half his crew rode off to Cheyenne this week on other business." The young man's eyes cut sideways in a way that told Jasper exactly what business that likely was, and exactly how uncomfortable the situation made him. "He asked me to come see if you all might spare some hands, seeing as how you have got your own channel most of the way dug already, and the water's easing on this side." The silence that followed was heavy with history, every person present aware of exactly what Cyrus Dunmore had done to earn whatever help he now needed, and Jasper watched Me's face carefully, wondering what she would say, understanding that whatever she decided would say something important about the kind of justice she believed in. "How many calves?" Me asked finally. 30, maybe more, ma'am, and there's cows caught in the mud too, stuck fast, that'll drown where they stand if nobody pulls them free." Me looked at Jasper, and he saw in her face the same struggle he felt in his own chest, the memory of Coltrane's men riding down on the Garrett barn with torches, set against the plain fact of 30 newborn calves and their mothers about to drown through no fault of their own. "The land does not care whose fence it floods," Me said finally, quietly, half to herself and half to Jasper. "And I will not let living creatures drown to satisfy my own anger, whatever their owner deserves." She raised her voice to carry across the working homesteaders. "Our channel here is close enough to finish that half of you can spare the time. Any man willing to ride down and help save Dunmore's calving grounds, I will not think less of you for it, and neither should any soul here, because saving a drowning calf is not the same as forgiving the man who owns it." It was Jasper who led a dozen men down to the Dunmore range that afternoon, and it was strange, working alongside Dunmore's remaining hands, digging a second diversion channel with the same desperate urgency, hauling stuck cattle out of the mud with ropes and sheer stubborn strength, while Cyrus Dunmore himself worked in the mud beside them, coat discarded, sleeves rolled up, no longer the cool, imperious rancher who had ridden into the Beckett yard with armed men at his back, but simply a man fighting to save his herd from a flood that respected no man's schemes or fortune. It was near dusk, with both diversion channels finally holding and the worst of the flood danger past, that Dunmore approached Jasper where he sat exhausted on an overturned bucket, catching his breath before the long ride back. "I did not expect you to send help," Dunmore said, wiping mud from his hands with a rag that did little good. "I did not send it for you," Jasper said honestly. "I sent it for 30 calves that never did anyone any harm. That is a different thing entirely from forgiving what you have done to the families on this road, Mr. Dunmore, and I would not want you thinking otherwise." Dunmore was quiet a moment, looking out over the muddy, exhausted chaos of his calving grounds, calves bawling for their mothers in the fading light, men and horses caked in mud up to the shoulder. "Marshal Whitfield's office sent word this morning," he said finally, not quite meeting Jasper's eyes. He is riding out from Cheyenne with 2 additional deputies to conduct a formal investigation into the matters Mrs. Beckett has raised. He will arrive within the week." "That does not surprise me," Jasper said. "I expect it should not surprise you either." "No," Dunmore admitted, and something in his voice had gone tired, older than his years. "It does not. I built this combine from 11 cows and a homestead claim 30 years ago, Watkins. I did not intend, when I began, to become the kind of man whose foreman burns barns and drowns lawmen in gulches. I am not certain I can tell you exactly when that changed, or whether I ever truly stopped it happening, or simply stopped asking Coltrane too many questions about his methods because the answers were profitable, and I preferred not to know them." "That is not an excuse," Jasper said quietly, "but I expect it might be the truth, and I expect a federal investigation is going to require you to answer for it regardless of how it happened." Dunmore nodded slowly, watching his men work the last stubborn cow free of the mud. "I do not suppose there is any undoing what has already been done," he said. "But I will not stand in the way of Marshal Whitfield's investigation, Watkins. I will not order Coltrane to do anything further against Mrs. Beckett or any family on that road. Whatever comes of this, it will not come from more violence at my order. I find, standing in this mud tonight, that I have very little stomach left for what my ambition has cost other men's families. It was not forgiveness, and it was not justice either, not yet, but it was something, a crack of honesty in a man who had spent 30 years building walls against exactly that kind of admission. And Jasper rode back to the Beckett homestead that night, bone-tired and mud-caked, but carrying something like hope in his chest for the first time in the whole long ordeal. He found me waiting up for him on the porch, a lantern burning low beside her, and when he told her what Dunmore had said, she was quiet a long while, turning the words over. "It does not undo Tom's death," she said finally. "And I do not believe Dunmore's conscience will keep Coltrane in line, not entirely, because a man like Coltrane has his own appetite for cruelty that does not answer only to his employer's orders. But Marshal Whitfield is coming, and he will bring the weight of federal authority with him, and between that and the evidence, I believe we finally have enough to see this through to a real reckoning, in a real courtroom before a judge who cannot be bought." "Then it is nearly finished," Jasper said. "Nearly," Mae agreed, and reached for his hand in the lantern light, mud and exhaustion and all. "Though I find, Jasper Watkins, that I am no longer in quite so great a hurry for it to be finished, if finishing it means you riding on to Cheyenne without me." He looked at her then, really looked, at the lantern light catching the tired lines of her face and the steady warmth in her eyes despite everything the day had cost her, and he understood that whatever words he chose next would matter more than any he had spoken in his life. "I do not intend to ride anywhere without you, Mae," he said. "Not to Cheyenne, not anywhere else, unless you ask it of me plainly. I have spent 11 years telling myself a cattle buyer has no business wanting more than an honest ledger and a fair season's work, and I have not believed that particular lie since the morning I pulled you out of a flooded coach, and you started giving me orders before you had even caught your breath." Mae laughed, low and real, and some of the day's weariness seemed to lift from her shoulders. "I have spent 8 months telling myself that grief and duty were the only things I had room for," she said, "and I stopped believing that somewhere around the time you stood in my yard and refused to step aside for Cyrus Dunmore. I do not know what comes after Marshal Whitfield finishes his investigation, Jasper. I do not know if I will stay in Larkspur Crossing or go back to deputy work full-time or do something else entirely. But I know I do not want to find out alone anymore." "Then do not," Jasper said simply, and when he leaned down and kissed her, there on the porch in the lantern light with the flood-swollen creek still rushing somewhere in the darkness below, it felt less like a beginning than like the answer to a question they had both been circling for 2 weeks without quite daring to ask it outright. Marshal Grant Whitfield arrived 6 days later with 2 deputies, and a federal warrant authorizing a full investigation into the Dunmore Combine's land dealings. And what followed was less dramatic than the ambush or the raid or the standoff in the homestead yard, but no less consequential. Affidavits were taken, formally and under oath, from the Garrett family and 3 other homesteads that had suffered similar threats. Jasper's ledgers were examined line by a federal auditor Whitfield brought with him, and the pattern of fraud proved so plain, so consistently documented across 2 years of honest record-keeping, that even Judge Prout, faced with federal authority and the certain prospect of his own complicity being exposed, found himself unable to obstruct the proceedings any further. Reeve Coltrane was arrested at the Dunmore Ranch itself, 10 days after the flood, on charges connected to the death of Deputy Marshal Thomas Beckett, charges built on the affidavits Mae had gathered, on a rope burn on a saddle horn that a territorial investigator matched to the specific type of restraint used to control a panicked horse, and on the testimony, finally given freely, of a Dunmore hand who had witnessed Coltrane's actions in Antelope Gulch and had kept silent for 8 months out of fear before Marshal Whitfield's presence gave him the courage to speak. Coltrane would stand trial in Cheyenne that autumn, and though Jasper and Mae would not see the verdict delivered until months later, the strength of the evidence left little doubt of the outcome that awaited him. Cyrus Dunmore himself was not charged with murder, no evidence ever surfacing that he had ordered Tom Beckett's death directly rather than simply benefiting from Coltrane's private brutality. But the fraud charges connected to Jasper's ledgers, and the forged deeds proved sufficient to see the Combine broken apart under federal order, its improperly acquired land returned to the homestead families who had been forced or frightened off it, and Dunmore himself fined a sum large enough to end his ambitions of controlling the valley, though not, as Mae observed with a certain grim satisfaction, large enough to leave him destitute, which she noted was likely the closest thing to justice the territorial court system was equipped to deliver, given the limits of the law as it stood. Judge Elias Prout resigned his circuit bench within the month, before the territorial governor could be petitioned to remove him, a quiet capitulation that Mae accepted as the closest thing to accountability the man was ever likely to face, though she made certain, through Marshal Whitfield, that the record of his complicity would follow him regardless of where he next sought appointment. It was a Tuesday evening in early June. The creek finally settled back into its ordinary summer banks, wildflowers thick across the meadows that had so recently been mud and floodwater, when Jasper Watkins asked Mae Beckett to marry him, not with any great ceremony, but sitting on the porch step where they had shared so many of their most honest conversations, a bouquet of wild larkspur he had picked that afternoon resting between them. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what comes next, now that Dunmore's Combine is broken and Coltrane sits in a Cheyenne jail awaiting trial, and your evidence has done everything you set out for it to do." "So have I," Mae said. "Aldrich has offered me a position buying cattle across a wider territory," Jasper said. "Nebraska, the Dakotas, wherever the herds are moving these days now that the old trail drives are giving way to rail shipping. It would mean traveling most of the year, no settled home to speak of, at least not for some seasons yet." He turned to face her fully. "Marshal Whitfield has also asked whether I might know of anyone suited to a permanent deputy commission, given how well your handling of this investigation went. Someone with judgment and courage and no fear of hard traveling. I told him I thought I might know just such a person." Mae's mouth curved, understanding exactly where this was heading. "You are asking whether I would consider a traveling life, Jasper Watkins, a deputy marshal's commission that takes me from territory to territory, alongside a cattle buyer doing much the same. I am asking whether you would consider building that life beside me," Jasper said, and now his voice lost its teasing edge entirely, went plain and earnest in a way that made Mae's breath catch. "I do not have a settled home to offer you, Mae. I have a horse, a good name in the cattle trade, and a heart that has belonged to you since a flooded creek 3 months ago, more completely than I ever thought possible for a man who spent a decade convincing himself he had no room in his life for such things. I'm not asking you to give up your commission, or your judgment, or your rifle. I am asking whether you might want a partner beside you while you use them, the same way you stood beside me in that yard when Dunmore came calling. Mae was quiet a long moment, looking out over the meadow where the wild larkspur grew thick and blue in the evening light, the same flowers Jasper had picked without quite realizing, until she pointed it out with a soft laugh, that he had gathered a bouquet of her own namesake. "I buried Tom 8 months ago," she said finally, "and I told myself for a long while that I had buried any chance at this kind of happiness alongside him. I do not believe that anymore, Jasper. I believe Tom would have wanted exactly this for me, a life that kept moving forward instead of one spent standing guard over grief until it hardened into the only thing left. I do not want a settled cabin and a garden plot, not yet, not while there is still this much wrong in this territory that a deputy's badge and an honest ledger might help set right. I want the road, Jasper. I want it with you." They were married 3 weeks later in Larkspur Crossing, a small ceremony performed by the new circuit judge appointed to replace Prout, attended by the Garrett family and Sarah and Orrin Hollies, and a dozen other homesteaders whose lives had been touched, one way or another, by the events of that spring. Mae wore a simple blue dress the exact color of the larkspur that grew wild across the valley, and Jasper stood beside her in a new coat purchased for the occasion. And when the judge pronounced them married, Mae Beckett Watkins turned to her new husband with the same steady, clear-eyed look she had given him across a flooded coach 3 months before, and kissed him without waiting for anyone's permission to do so. That night in the small hotel room they had taken for their wedding night, the town's noise settling into quiet outside their window, Jasper found himself struck again by the particular wonder of her, the woman who had pulled a stranger from a wrecked coach and then spent 3 months proving, day by day, choice by choice, that her courage ran as deep in tenderness as it did in danger. She came to him without hesitation, and without the careful reserve she had worn like armor through so much of their journey together. And what passed between them that night was not the desperate collision of two people running from danger, but something slower and more deliberate, a claiming freely chosen by two people who had watched each other fight and grieve and rebuild, and had decided, with clear eyes and steady hearts, that they wanted no other partner for whatever came next. Afterward, lying in the quiet dark with her head against his chest and his arms around her, Jasper thought that he had spent 11 years keeping ledgers that never lied to him, and that he had never once imagined a woman could feel like the truest, most honest account he would ever keep. They left Larkspur Crossing a week after the wedding, riding south together toward Cheyenne, where Mae would formalize her permanent commission with Marshal Whitfield, and Jasper would meet with Aldrich to discuss the terms of his expanded territory. 2 saddlebags packed light, a good horse each, Mae's rifle riding easy across her saddle bow and Jasper's ledger case, battered now but still faithful, lashed behind his own. The military road stretched out ahead of them under a wide blue June sky, the meadows on either side thick with new grass and grazing cattle, calves grown sturdy on their legs now, and somewhere behind them, fading into memory rather than disappearing entirely, lay a broken combine, a chastened land baron working to rebuild an honest ranch from the wreckage of his own ambition, a foreman awaiting trial for a murder that would finally be answered, and a valley of homestead families who could plant their gardens and raise their calves without fear for the first time in 2 years. "Where to first?" Mae asked, drawing her horse up alongside his as they crested the rise above the Beckett homestead, the little cabin visible below with its garden coming in green and its barn standing solid against the sky, no longer merely a widow's lonely holding but a home they would return to between seasons, whenever the road allowed. "Cheyenne first," Jasper said, "and then wherever the herds are moving and the law needs carrying." "I do not much care which road we take, Mae, so long as I am taking it beside you." She smiled at that, the wide, unguarded smile he had come to treasure more than any other sight the territory had to offer, and together they turned their horses south, riding into a future neither of them could have imagined 3 months before on a flooded creek crossing, but one that both of them now could not imagine facing without the other. The wildflowers bloomed thick and blue across the meadows behind them as they rode, and the creek ran clear and steady in its banks, and the whole wide territory lay open before them, dangerous still in places, honest work still waiting to be done, but no longer faced alone by either of them. Not now, not ever again. And that, Jasper thought as he watched his wife ride easy and confident beside him under the wide Wyoming sky, was worth more than any ledger had ever taught him to count.